For 10 long years, I had built my life around one fundamental belief: that love was like a delicate plant that needed constant nurturing, something that would grow stronger and more resilient over time if you simply put in enough care and attention. Every single day of that decade, I had woken up with this conviction guiding my actions, shaping my decisions, molding my very identity. My marriage wasn't just a relationship to me, it was my life's work, my magnum opus, the central project around which all other aspects of my existence orbited. My wife Evelyn, beautiful, mysterious Evelyn with her soft hazel eyes that seemed to hold entire universes within them, with that gentle smile that once made my heart skip several beats in rapid succession, with that voice that wrapped around me like the warmest, safest blanket on the coldest winter night. She was my everything, my North Star, the fixed point by which I navigated all of life's turbulent seas. I had constructed my entire world with painstaking care around this remarkable woman, this enigma I called my wife, convinced beyond any shadow of doubt that we were partners in the truest sense of the word, teammates standing shoulder to shoulder against whatever challenges, whatever storms, whatever unpredictable twists of fate life might throw our direction. I believed with every fiber of my being that ours was a bond forged in something unbreakable, something eternal. But all those years of careful construction, all that meticulous architecture of love and trust and shared dreams, it all came crashing down around me in one devastating instant, demolished by a single overheard conversation that lasted mere minutes but might as well have been an eternity for how completely it altered the course of my existence. That particular evening had begun like countless others before it, completely ordinary, utterly unremarkable in every conceivable way. I had returned home from work slightly later than usual, my body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that seeps deep into your bones after a long day of mental exertion, yet my heart still lifted at the thought of seeing Evelyn, of sharing the small, quiet moments that comprised the fabric of our married life. As I stepped through the familiar threshold of our home, the air was perfumed with the comforting scent of vanilla and lavender from the candles she loved to light, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed so much of our shared history. I mechanically went through my usual routine, removing my shoes, loosening my tie that suddenly felt like a noose around my neck, taking a deep breath to call out to her, when her voice, floating from the living room, stopped me dead in my tracks. At first, in that initial split second of recognition, I assumed she must be speaking to a friend or perhaps her sister. Her tone carried that particular cadence of casual intimacy, that lightness that comes with conversations unburdened by pretense or performance. But then, like a thunderclap shattering the stillness of a summer afternoon, I heard my name, Daniel, spoken with such palpable frustration, such undisguised irritation that my entire body went rigid with shock. "Daniel just doesn't get me anymore," she continued, and each word landed like a physical blow to my solar plexus. "I can't stand being around him. The way he chews his food, the way he tells the same stupid stories over and over, the way he thinks his predictable little routines are endearing when they're actually just suffocating." I stood frozen in that hallway, my blood turning to ice in my veins, my fingers gripping the doorframe with such intensity that I could feel the wood biting into my flesh. "Every single thing about him annoys me now," she confessed to whoever was on the other end of that call, her voice dripping with a resentment I'd never heard directed at me before. "He's so painfully predictable, so boring, so small. I feel like I'm slowly being smothered to death by his relentless adequacy." The words slammed into me with the force of a freight train, leaving me breathless and disoriented. My heart pounded so violently in my chest that I could feel its reverberations in my temples, the rhythmic thudding nearly drowning out whatever she said next. Some primitive part of my brain screamed at me to rationalize this away. Surely I'd misheard. Surely this was some terrible misunderstanding. Surely my beloved Evelyn, the woman who had stood before our friends and family and vowed to love me for better or worse, couldn't possibly be saying these vicious, hateful things about me. But the awful truth was undeniable. The frustration in her voice, the exhaustion lacing every syllable, the unmistakable sound of truths too long suppressed finally breaking free. This wasn't some heat of the moment outburst. This was the sound of someone who had been sitting with these feelings for a very, very long time. I should have marched into that room. I should have confronted her immediately, demanded to know what she meant, why she felt this way, when this seismic shift in her perception of me had occurred. But instead, paralyzed by shock and something dangerously close to terror, I remained rooted to that spot in the hallway, half hidden in the shadows like some pathetic eavesdropper in my own home, my fingers now digging into the doorframe so hard I could feel splinters embedding themselves in my skin. Then, as if the universe hadn't already delivered enough punishment for one evening, her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, and what she said next shattered whatever fragile illusion of a happy marriage I'd been clinging to. The truth is, I haven't loved him in years, she admitted with a quiet resignation that cut deeper than any shouted insult ever could. I don't know how to leave. He's comfortable, reliable, predictable, but God, I don't want predictable anymore. I want. Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung in the air between us, thick and poisonous. My chest constricted so violently I genuinely forgot how to breathe for several terrifying seconds. The love of my life, the woman I'd built my entire world around, the person I'd devoted a full decade of my existence to loving, supporting, cherishing, saw me as nothing more than a burden, a cage, a comfortable habit she couldn't quite break. I have no idea how long I stood there in that darkened hallway, drowning in the devastating weight of her words, but with each passing second, I could feel something fundamental inside me fracturing beyond repair. Part of me, the wounded, furious part, wanted to storm into that living room and unleash a torrent of accusations, to force her to look me in the eye as she explained how she could say such things about the man who had loved her so completely for so long. Another part, the broken, humiliated part, wanted nothing more than to disappear, to erase the last 10 years from existence, to pretend this horrific revelation had never happened at all. But what I actually did next surprised even me. With a calm that felt completely alien given the circumstances, I turned on my heel and walked silently to our bedroom, where I methodically retrieved a duffel bag from the closet and began packing with a detached efficiency that belied the emotional maelstrom raging inside me. My hands trembled slightly as I folded clothes and placed them inside the bag, enough for a few days, maybe a week. My mind strangely blank even as my body moved with single-minded purpose. As I zipped the bag shut, my gaze inadvertently fell upon our wedding photo sitting on the dresser. Evelyn radiant in her white dress, her arms wrapped around me with what I had always believed was genuine affection, her eyes shining with what I'd convinced myself was real love and promise. Staring at that frozen moment of apparent happiness now, I felt like the world's greatest fool. Had it all been an elaborate act? Had she been counting down the days until she could escape this marriage? Had every I love you, every tender moment, every shared laugh been nothing more than a carefully maintained facade? I clenched my jaw so hard I could hear my teeth grinding, forcibly tearing my gaze away from that painful reminder of all I believed we had. As I walked back down the hallway, duffel bag in hand, I heard her laugh, that light, musical sound I'd once loved so dearly, at something her unseen conversation partner said. The casual ease of it, the complete lack of guilt or remorse in that sound, sent a fresh wave of nausea crashing through me. How could she sound so carefree, so utterly unburdened, mere minutes after eviscerating me with her words? I paused for just a moment at the entrance to the living room, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag, before stepping inside with a calmness I didn't recognize in myself. She was exactly where I'd known she'd be, curled up on the couch, phone pressed to her ear, that familiar smile playing about her lips. The smile that died the instant she saw me standing there with my packed bag, my expression unreadable even to myself. "Daniel?" she said, blinking rapidly as confusion flickered across her carefully composed features. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch between us, watching with something approaching clinical detachment as she shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. I wanted to see it, that precise moment when realization dawned, when she understood that I'd heard everything, when the carefully constructed walls around her secret life came crashing down around her. And then, when I finally spoke, it was with a quiet finality that surprised even me. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Evelyn." Her lips parted slightly, her eyes widening in something that might have been shock or guilt or even fear, but no words emerged. I didn't wait for her to find them. Turning on my heel with a precision that felt military in its execution, I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold night air without so much as a backward glance. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what came next. All I knew with absolute certainty was that I was done being someone's consolation prize, done playing the role of comfortable placeholder in my own marriage, done pretending that love could flourish where respect had clearly withered and died. The night air hit my face like a physical slap as I stood on the porch, but I barely registered the cold. My mind was a whirling vortex of fragmented thoughts and half-formed realizations, my heartbeat pounding so loudly in my ears it nearly drowned out all other sound. I didn't have a destination in mind, couldn't have articulated one if pressed, but some primal instinct told me I needed to move, to put as much physical distance between myself and that house as possible. With mechanical movements, I climbed into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel with such intensity that my knuckles turned bone white beneath the strain. A deep, shuddering breath escaped my lips, but it did nothing to steady the chaotic storm raging inside me. Evelyn's words played on an endless, tortuous loop in my mind. I haven't loved him in years. I just don't know how to leave. He's comfortable. I don't want comfortable. Each repetition felt like another twist of the knife, another layer of betrayal peeling back to reveal even more painful truths beneath. Logically, I knew I should have been furious, should have been breaking things, shouting at the universe, unleashing the white-hot rage bubbling just beneath my carefully maintained composure. But all I felt was a yawning, unbearable emptiness, the kind that settles deep in your bones and makes you question every single thing you thought you knew about yourself, your life, your relationships. 10 years, a full decade of my life devoted to loving a woman who had apparently seen me as nothing more than a convenient placeholder, a safe option, a comfortable habit she couldn't quite break. The magnitude of that realization was almost too large to comprehend all at once. But perhaps the most devastating realization of all was that I hadn't seen it coming, not a single warning sign, not one red flag waving frantically to get my attention. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed the gradual erosion of whatever love she'd once felt for me? I stared blankly at the road ahead, my vision blurring slightly as I mentally retraced every step of our relationship, searching desperately for the cracks I'd apparently been too willfully ignorant to notice. Practical considerations began to surface through the emotional fog. Where would I go tonight? Most of our friends were mutual, and the thought of showing up on someone's doorstep in the middle of the night with a hastily packed duffel bag and a story too humiliating to articulate was unbearable. My parents lived several states away, and checking into a hotel felt too final, too much like admitting this was really happening. So without conscious decision, I simply started driving, letting the monotonous rhythm of the road soothe my fractured nerves. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, the occasional streetlight casting long, ghostly shadows across the pavement as I navigated without any real destination in mind. As I drove, my mind continued its relentless excavation of our marriage, unearthing memory after memory and examining each one under this new, devastating lens. The way Evelyn had gradually stopped reaching for my hand in public. The barely concealed sighs when I talked about my day. The increasing amount of time she spent glued to her phone, smiling at messages from people I didn't know. Had those been clues? Had she been waiting for me to notice her growing dissatisfaction? Or worse, had she been hoping I'd be the one to end things, sparing her the discomfort of having to do it herself? Before I knew it, I found myself pulling into an empty parking lot near the waterfront, my chest heaving with the weight of my thoughts. The waves crashed against the shore in the distance, steady, rhythmic, an unsettling contrast to the chaos churning inside me. I turned off the engine and rested my forehead against the steering wheel, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the profound humiliation of knowing my wife had been pretending for years, going through the motions of a marriage she'd apparently checked out of long ago. My jaw clenched as I swallowed against the lump in my throat, fighting to maintain some semblance of composure. Part of me, the hopelessly optimistic part that apparently hadn't gotten the memo yet, wanted to believe this was salvageable. That maybe Evelyn's words had been spoken in a moment of temporary frustration, that our marriage could weather this storm like it had weathered others before it. But the cold, hard truth was that those words hadn't been spoken in anger, they'd been delivered with a quiet resignation that spoke of long-held feelings finally being given voice. The painful reality was that I'd already lost her, I just hadn't realized it until tonight. A sudden vibration jolted me from my thoughts, my phone lighting up in the darkness of the car. Evelyn's name flashed across the screen, and for a long moment, I simply stared at it, torn between the desperate need for answers and the equally powerful urge to never speak to her again. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Daniel?" Her voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Where are you?" I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between us, heavy with everything left unsaid. When I finally spoke, my voice was surprisingly steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I heard you," I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end, then a softer, more tentative response. "What?" "I heard you, Evelyn," I repeated, each word measured and precise. I heard everything. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear her scrambling to formulate a response, to find some way to spin this, to make it anything other than what it was. I didn't mean, She began, then faltered. Don't lie to me, I interrupted, my voice low but firm. Her breath hitched audibly on the other end of the line. Another prolonged silence, then finally, almost meekly, where are you? I could have told her. I could have given her the chance to explain, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But in that moment, I realized with startling clarity that I didn't want to hear her excuses. So I hung up, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to accept the painful truth. I had spent a decade loving a woman who didn't love me back, and I wasn't going to waste another second of my life pretending otherwise. I didn't sleep that night. After ending the call with Evelyn, I simply sat in my car, staring out at the dark expanse of ocean stretching endlessly before me. The waves continued their relentless assault on the shore, completely indifferent to the personal catastrophe unfolding just yards away. My hands remained locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension, my entire body rigid as if bracing for an impact that had already occurred. At some point, I checked my phone again, 8 missed calls, 3 text messages. The first was terse. Where are you? The second carried a hint of desperation. Come home. We need to talk. But it was the third one that made my stomach twist violently. You're being dramatic. Let's be adults about this. Dramatic. I let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. I had just overheard my wife confess that she couldn't stand me, that she hadn't loved me in years, and I was the one being dramatic? She had reduced our entire marriage to something inconvenient, something to be endured rather than cherished, and now she wanted to discuss it like we were negotiating a business contract? With a sudden surge of anger, I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and rubbed my hands over my face, exhaustion finally beginning to creep in at the edges of my awareness. But sleep was impossible. My body was still running on a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and heartbreak, my mind relentlessly replaying every ignored warning sign, every dismissed red flag from the past few years. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been willfully blind. And yet, despite everything, I felt a strange, almost surreal sense of calm settling over me. The kind that comes when the worst has already happened and there's nothing left to do but accept it. As the first faint hints of morning light began creeping over the horizon, I started the car again. I couldn't sit here forever, no matter how appealing the idea might be. I didn't know what my next move was, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going home. Not today, maybe not ever. Instead, I drove, no destination in mind, just the open road stretching endlessly before me, each mile putting more distance between myself and the life I no longer recognized. I passed through empty streets as the world slowly woke up around me, completely oblivious to the fact that mine had just ended. It wasn't until my stomach reminded me sharply that I hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours that I finally pulled into the parking lot of a small diner on the outskirts of town. The kind of place I would normally never consider stopping, with its flickering neon sign and half-empty lot. But right now, I just needed somewhere to sit, somewhere to breathe, somewhere that wasn't my car or the home I could no longer bear to face. The diner was exactly what you'd expect: cracked vinyl booths, the smell of stale coffee and frying grease, a tired-looking waitress wiping down the counter with a rag that had probably seen better days. I took a seat at the counter, my body heavy with exhaustion, my mind still reeling from the events of the past several hours. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, appeared almost immediately, pouring me a cup of coffee without asking, as if she could tell just by looking at me that I needed it. "Tough night?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You could say that," I replied, my voice rough with disuse. To her credit, she didn't pry, just nodded knowingly and slid a menu toward me before walking away to give me space. I appreciated that more than I could say. The last thing I wanted right now was to explain my situation to a stranger when I barely understood it myself. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the menu without really seeing it, the world around me feeling strangely distant, like I was observing everything through a thick pane of glass. The murmured conversations of other customers, the clink of silverware against plates, the occasional burst of laughter from the kitchen. It all felt so normal, so mundane, as if the entire world was continuing on exactly as it always had while my personal universe had imploded just hours earlier. I should have been home right now. I should have been waking up next to Evelyn, making coffee, preparing for another ordinary day in what I believed was an extraordinary marriage. Instead, I was here, in this dingy diner, trying to figure out how to piece my life back together when I didn't even know where to begin. Then my phone buzzed again, another text from Evelyn. Please, it read, at least let me explain. Explain what? That she'd been pretending for years? That every I love you had been a lie? That she'd stayed not out of love, but out of convenience? My jaw clenched as I shoved the phone back into my pocket, unwilling and unable to engage with her attempts at damage control. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. Maybe I never would be. For the first time in years, I had to think about myself, what I wanted, what I needed, who I was outside of my marriage. And the terrifying truth was, I had no idea where to even start. I sat in that diner until my coffee grew cold, my thoughts circling the drain of my shattered marriage. The weight of everything that had happened pressed against my chest like a physical weight, but that strange numbness continued to creep in at the edges, dulling the sharpest pangs of heartbreak. I should have been falling apart completely, but instead I just felt empty, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside me and removed everything that made me who I was. At some point, the waitress returned. She didn't ask if I was ready to order, just studied me for a long moment before speaking. You look like someone who needs a hot meal, she said matter-of-factly. Pancakes or eggs? I blinked at her, too exhausted to even process the question. Pancakes, I heard myself say. She nodded, scribbled something on her notepad, and walked away without another word. I didn't have the energy to protest or even to feel embarrassed about being so transparent in my distress. I just sat there, staring blankly at my reflection in the diner's greasy window. My hair disheveled, my shirt wrinkled from spending the night in my car, my eyes hollow and shadowed. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. The bell above the door chimed as someone new entered the diner, but I didn't turn to look. I kept my eyes fixed on the window, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, its light doing little to dispel the darkness that had settled inside me. Then I heard a voice I knew as well as my own, say my name, and my stomach dropped to my shoes. Daniel. I turned slowly, already bracing myself, and there she was. Evelyn, standing just inside the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her hair slightly messy as if she'd rushed out of the house without bothering to fix it. Her expression was unreadable, some complicated mix of frustration, desperation, and something else I couldn't quite identify. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The diner seemed to grow unnaturally quiet around us, as if everyone present was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, I exhaled slowly, gripping my coffee cup a little tighter. How did you find me? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. She took a hesitant step forward. You always drive when you're upset, she said, as if this were common knowledge. I figured you'd end up somewhere quiet. She glanced around the diner, her lips pressing together in a thin line. Didn't expect a place like this, though. I didn't respond to that, didn't give her the satisfaction of any reaction at all. She sighed, shifting her weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. You disappeared, she said finally, her voice carrying an accusatory edge. I woke up and you were just gone. I didn't disappear, I corrected calmly. I left. She flinched slightly at that, as if the distinction mattered. Well, I continued, gesturing to the empty stool beside me, since you're here, go ahead. Explain. She hesitated, clearly thrown by my calm demeanor. She'd probably expected tears, shouting, maybe even begging. But after a moment, she sat down, folding her hands on the counter in front of her. She looked nervous, which was new. The Evelyn I knew was always so sure of herself, so in control. I didn't mean for you to hear that, she began, her voice uncharacteristically small. I was just, venting. I couldn't help it, I scoffed at that. Venting, I repeated flatly. Yes, she said, leaning forward slightly. Daniel, every couple goes through rough patches. Sometimes we say things we don't mean when we're frustrated. I tilted my head, studying her carefully. How long has our rough patch been going on, exactly? Her lips parted, but no words came out. She hesitated, clearly searching for the right thing to say. I nodded slowly, the answer written plainly in her silence. You said you haven't loved me in years, Evelyn, I reminded her, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. That's not a rough patch. That's not something you say in the heat of the moment. That's the truth. Her eyes darted away from mine, guilt flashing across her features before she could school them back into neutrality. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange numbness in my chest crack just a little. All this time, I said quietly, you've just been. What? Waiting for me to leave first? For some excuse to walk away? No, she said quickly, too quickly. I wasn't waiting, I just. She rubbed her temples, exhaling sharply. I didn't know how to bring it up. Bring up the fact that you don't love me anymore? My voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. So instead you just, what, let me keep trying? Let me believe we were happy when you checked out years ago? She winced at that, but didn't deny it. I didn't mean for it to be like this, she said weakly, and I had to laugh, a bitter, humorless sound. But it is, I pointed out. Just then, the waitress arrived with my pancakes, setting the plate in front of me with a pointed look at Evelyn before walking away without a word. The tension between us was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Evelyn watched as I picked up my fork, her hands tightening into fists on the countertop. So what now? She asked, and for the first time, I heard genuine uncertainty in her voice. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate bite of my pancakes, letting the silence stretch between us until it became almost unbearable. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured. I don't know yet, I admitted. But I do know one thing. I'm not going to be your comfortable option anymore. Her face paled at that, her carefully constructed composure cracking just a little around the edges. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt something approaching control, not over the situation, but over myself, my reactions, my choices. Evelyn sat beside me, her expression unreadable, but I knew her too well. She was nervous. She was scrambling. This wasn't how she'd expected this confrontation to go. Maybe she'd thought I'd break down, beg for an explanation, fight to save a marriage she'd already checked out of years ago. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. I wasn't going to be the man who begged to be loved. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then hesitated, clearly reconsidering. Instead, she reached for a sugar packet on the counter, fidgeting with it absently, avoiding my gaze. I watched her carefully, noting all the little tells I'd learned over the years. The way she bit her lip when she was lying, the way her fingers tapped when she was holding something back. I used to love those little quirks, those tells that made her human. Now, I hated how well I still knew her. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. I'm not proud of what I said, she admitted, her voice low. But you have to understand, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I took another slow bite of my pancakes, barely tasting them. So what were you trying to do, exactly? She frowned, shifting uncomfortably on the stool. I don't know, she said after a moment. I guess. I felt stuck. For a long time, like I woke up one day and realized I wasn't the same person I was when we got married. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. And I know that's not fair to you. I know I should have talked to you about it. But Daniel, you've never been good at seeing the signs. You always assume everything's fine, even when it's not. I stared at her, incredulous. Because you let me think it was, I pointed out, my voice sharper than I'd intended. She flinched, but didn't argue. I set my fork down carefully, leaning forward slightly. Let me ask you something, Evelyn, I said, my voice dangerously calm. If I hadn't overheard you last night, would you have ever told me? She looked away then, and that was all the answer I needed. My jaw clenched as I felt my stomach twist violently. I'd been married to a woman who was perfectly content to live a lie, who had chosen to stay not out of love, but because it was easier than leaving. And the worst part? I still didn't know if she would have ever left on her own, or if she would have just stayed, quietly miserable, resenting me more with each passing year until we were both too old and set in our ways to change anything. She rubbed her temples, clearly frustrated. I don't know what you want me to say, she muttered. I let out a short, humorless laugh. That's the problem, Evelyn, I said, leaning back in my seat. You never do. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the diner continued around us. The clink of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. A stark contrast to the tension between us. Then, unexpectedly, she did something that caught me completely off guard. She reached across the counter and placed her hand over mine. It was pure instinct to look at her then, and for the first time since this conversation began, I saw something raw and unguarded in her expression. Not guilt, not regret, but fear. I don't want to lose you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked, genuinely stunned. Of all the things I'd expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my hand out from under hers, studying her carefully. You don't want to lose me, I repeated slowly, but you don't love me. She swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. I don't know, she said, her voice small. I don't know if what we have is love anymore, Daniel. But I don't want it to end like this. I let out a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. You don't want it to end because it's messy, I corrected. Because it's uncomfortable, not because you actually want me. She didn't deny it, and that, more than anything else, was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I exhaled slowly, pushing my plate away. I don't know what's worse, I admitted. The fact that you don't love me anymore, or the fact that you would have let me keep loving you anyway. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but I found, to my surprise, that I didn't feel bad for her. Not anymore. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a few bills and tossed them onto the counter before standing up. Evelyn followed suit, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Daniel, she began, her voice cracking slightly, can we at least? No, I cut her off, my voice firm but not unkind. We can't. She inhaled sharply, as if I'd struck her, but I didn't stay to see her reaction. Turning on my heel, I walked past the counter and out of the diner, stepping into the morning light with a sense of finality that surprised even me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what came next. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I wasn't going home. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt different somehow, lighter, despite the weight of everything that had happened. The sun was higher now, warming my skin, but I still felt cold inside, as if some fundamental part of me had been extinguished and might never warm up again. I walked to my car, gripping the door handle, but didn't immediately get in. Instead, I stood there for a long moment, staring at my reflection in the window, the tired eyes, the stubble along my jaw that I hadn't bothered to shave, the shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Was this what 10 years with Evelyn had reduced me to? Someone so accustomed to being taken for granted that I hadn't even noticed when I'd become an obligation rather than a beloved partner. A sudden noise behind me made me tense, footsteps, then her voice. Daniel, Evelyn called, her voice carrying a note of desperation I'd never heard before. Please don't walk away. I shut my eyes for a brief moment, gathering my strength, before turning to face her. She stood just outside the diner, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression caught somewhere between panic and frustration. I don't understand, she said, shaking her head slightly. Why are you making this so final? We can talk about this. We can figure it out. Figure what out? My voice was quiet but carried an undeniable weight. How to pretend for another 5 years? How to make it easier for you to stay miserable? She flinched at that, her throat working as she swallowed hard. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered, and for the first time, I thought I might have heard genuine remorse in her voice. But you did, I pointed out, running a hand through my hair in frustration. You think this is just about what you said last night, Evelyn? This is about the years you spent looking at me like I was furniture. The years you let me believe in a marriage you'd already checked out of. She bit her lip, looking away, and for a brief moment, I saw the girl I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But the moment passed, and all that remained was the woman who had looked at our marriage and found it wanting. I wasn't trying to be cruel, she said softly. No, I agreed, you were trying to be comfortable. Her head snapped up at that, her eyes flashing with something like anger. And what about you? She challenged. Do you really think you were the perfect husband? That I was the only one who was unhappy? I let out a bitter laugh. No, I admitted, but at least I wasn't lying to you. The words hit her like a physical blow, her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she might actually argue. But then her shoulders slumped, and just like that, she looked small, smaller than I'd ever seen her. I'd spent so many years seeing her as the center of my universe, the person around whom my entire life revolved. But standing there in that dingy diner parking lot, watching her struggle to find words that would make this better, I realized something that should have been obvious long ago. She wasn't my world. She was just a part of it, and a part that no longer fit. She inhaled shakily, visibly steeling herself. So what now? She asked, and for the first time, I heard genuine uncertainty in her voice. I glanced at my car, then back at her. Now, I said calmly, I figure out who I am without you. Her breath hitched audibly, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw real understanding dawn in her eyes. The realization that I wasn't waiting for her to fix this, that I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms of our separation, that I was done. I didn't wait for a response. Turning away, I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I saw her in the rearview mirror, standing frozen in the parking lot, watching me go. For a brief moment, guilt tried to creep in, and I almost let it. But then I pressed my foot on the gas, and I didn't look back. I drove without any real destination in mind, just mile after mile of open road, the hum of the engine filling the silence where Evelyn's voice used to be. The world blurred past me, towns, highways, fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon. I wasn't running away, exactly, but I wasn't ready to stop moving either. The weight of everything settled deeper into my chest with each passing mile, not just the heartbreak of losing my wife, but the years of being blind to the truth, of convincing myself that love and effort could compensate for the absence of genuine connection. I'd lived in a carefully constructed fantasy, and now that it had crumbled, I didn't know who I was outside of it. Somewhere along the way, I pulled into a gas station on the edge of a small town, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, with an old-fashioned sign hanging over the pumps and a single, rusted vending machine buzzing near the entrance. I stepped out of the car, stretching my stiff limbs, the cool air stinging against my tired skin. Inside, the clerk barely glanced up as I grabbed a bottle of water and a protein bar, but as I turned toward the counter, someone else caught my attention, an older man, maybe in his late 50s, standing near the back of the store flipping through a magazine. There was something vaguely familiar about him, though I couldn't place why. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he looked up, and our eyes met. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in his expression, and then he nodded, as if he knew exactly what I was going through. "You look like you've been driving a long time," he observed, his voice rough with age. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," I admitted, trying to outrun something. A dry, humorless laugh escaped me. Or maybe just trying to figure out where I'm supposed to be. The man set the magazine down and leaned against the counter. "That's the thing about leaving," he said thoughtfully. "You don't always know where you're going. But sometimes, that's the best part." His words settled over me with unexpected weight. I paid for my items and stepped back outside, the man's observation echoing in my mind. I hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered that not knowing where I was headed might actually be a good thing. Sitting back in my car, gripping the steering wheel, I stared at the road ahead and realized that for the first time in years, I didn't have to answer to anyone. I didn't have to be the man who came home on time, who made sure dinner was ready, who asked if Evelyn needed anything before considering his own needs. For the first time in a decade, I was free. The thought was terrifying, but also strangely exhilarating. Pulling out my phone, I scrolled past Evelyn's unread messages and missed calls, stopping instead on a name I hadn't thought about in far too long. Lucas. My brother. We hadn't spoken much in recent years, life, work, marriage had all gotten in the way, but if there was anyone who would understand what I was going through, it was him. Taking a deep breath, I hit the call button. It rang twice before he answered, his voice groggy with sleep. "Daniel?" he mumbled, then, realizing the time, cleared his throat. "Man, it's been a while. Everything okay?" I hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "No," I admitted, "but I think I'm finally ready to figure out what okay looks like." To his credit, Lucas didn't press for details, he just listened as I gave him the broad strokes of what had happened. When I finished, he was silent for a moment before saying, "You know you don't have to figure this out alone, right?" For the first time in days, I felt something inside me loosen slightly. Lucas invited me to stay with him for a while, no pressure, no expectations, just a place to land while I sorted through the wreckage of my old life. And for the first time since I'd walked out of that house, I said yes to something that wasn't tied to Evelyn. The drive to Lucas's place took several hours, and the entire time, I kept expecting my phone to ring, kept bracing for another attempt from Evelyn to reel me back in. But the call never came. Maybe she'd finally understood that I wasn't coming back. Maybe she'd realized that some fractures can't be repaired. By the time I pulled into Lucas's driveway, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. He was waiting outside, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, as if he'd been standing there for a while. When I stepped out of the car, he didn't say anything at first, just looked me over, taking in the exhaustion that was undoubtedly written all over my face. Then he nodded, as if he understood everything without needing to hear a word. "Good to see you, man," he said simply, and something in my chest loosened at those words. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't expect me to pretend everything was fine. He just knew. Inside, he handed me a beer, and we sat on his porch in comfortable silence, the cicadas humming in the distance, the air warm but not oppressive. It had been years since I'd experienced this kind of peace, no tension, no unspoken expectations, no weight of someone else's dissatisfaction pressing down on me. After a while, Lucas broke the silence with a single question. "Do you regret it?" I took a slow sip of my beer, considering. Did I regret walking away from the life I'd built, from the woman I'd loved for a decade? "No," I said finally. "I regret not seeing it sooner. But leaving? No. I think it's the first thing I've done for myself in a long time." Lucas nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Good, he said simply. And for the first time, I believed it. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel like a trap. It felt open, wide, full of possibilities I couldn't yet see. And I was finally ready to see where it led.